let's look next at the brainstem. The midbrain, which we'll color in pink here in just a second, is located below the diencephalon. So highlight that in pink. And then right here on your paper, this is the midbrain. Now, the front of the midbrain has some bulges that are called cerebral peduncles. And the reason they're worth mentioning particularly is because they contain a nucleus called the substantia nigra. And they're helpful in the coordination of fine motor movements. And they include a basal nucleus, meaning a group of cells that's not in the cortex. And I think that bears a little bit more explaining. Okay, so remember when we were talking about the cerebrum and how the frontal lobe does certain things and the parietal lobe does certain things? Well, all of those certain things are performed by cell bodies located in the outer couple of centimeters, or centimeter even, of the brain. And below that is mostly white matter. And white matter is just sending the information to and fro, basically the insulated wires. And the insulation on those wires is myelination, or fat, and that's why it looks white. Whereas the cell bodies are kind of a beigey gray, and so we call that part gray matter. Okay, so then back to this phrase, basal nucleus. What that means is, see how low down this is? It's not on the cortex, and so it's called basal nucleus because it's a group of cell bodies that release dopamine. So it's called the substantia nigra, substantial because it's pretty good sized, and nigra because it stains black because there's so much dopamine in it. Releases dopamine. In the disease called Parkinson's disease, what happens is the cells that release dopamine in the substantia nigra die. And once they start dying, the person has a lot of trouble initiating and controlling movement. So what that tells us is that these cells are important in initiating and controlling movement. And you might know that one of the treatments is that they are given a synthetic form of dopamine. Okay, then there is another mentionable part of the midbrain. We'll put that on the back of it. And it is these 4 bumps on the back called the corpora, meaning body. Corpora means body. Quadrigemina means the 4 twins. Quad means 4, Gemini means twins. So the corpora, quadrigemina, or you might hear it called the superior, meaning above, and inferior, meaning below, colliculi. And this is a structure you'll be finding on the brain. And I'm going to try and fairly simply summarize some of the jobs that go on here that have to do with hearing, and smell safety reflexes. So, for example, if you hear a car approaching really quickly behind you, but you can't see it, then you would automatically have neurons in your brain that would help you to move away from that quickly approaching sound. All right, so now let's go on to the Pons and use an orange pen for that. It has this bulge that goes out on it. And the word Pons means bridge. And you can look at it and tell yourself, I wonder what that is a bridge to. We're going to have to put Pons down here. It's actually, structurally, it's above the medulla oblongata, but we put the medulla oblongata functions here. So just Pons means bridge. And what is it a bridge to? Well, I can think of two reasons. I know the original name they gave it is because it actually is like a bridge to the cerebellum, but look, it's also a bridge between the lower parts of the brainstem and essentially then the spinal cord and the upper parts of the brain. So we'll put two reasons that it's important as a bridge. It connects the cerebellum info to the cerebrum. Or actually, probably a better word would be conveys. So it sends information from the cerebellum up to the cerebrum for processing. And then the other way too. It's also a bridge between the lower brainstem and higher brain structures. So everything has to go through here. Okay, so in addition to being this relay center, kind of reminiscent of the thalamus, right? Kind of a relay center, the Pons also contain some important nuclei, meaning groups of cell bodies that are doing a job. And when I use plural, I mean there are several groups. So you don't have to put this on there necessarily, but maybe there's a group here, and maybe there's a group here, and maybe there's a group here of cells that are all working on different roles in maintaining your respiration and when you're breathing. So it contains nuclei that control the rate and depth of your breathing. You don't have to think about that when you exercise. Your body naturally helps you to breathe deeper and more rapidly. Okay, so while we're on the topic of this control of respiration, you should note that it communicates and works together with the medulla to accomplish this, the medulla oblongata. And while we're talking about the medulla oblongata, again, let's see if I can find room to put this on here. Another job of the medulla that I didn't mention before is that it lacks a blood-brain barrier. So I'm using my purple pen about the medulla. It lacks a complete blood-brain barrier. and it's the vomiting center is located here. So maybe you can guess why it makes sense that this part of the brain is not as protected from chemicals in your bloodstream as everywhere else. Everywhere else in your brain is protected by the blood-brain barrier. It means it's very difficult for substances in the blood to just casually go and interact with neurons. But here, there's a special design that allows chemicals in the blood to interact. And you notice it's the vomiting center. So if for some reason a foodborne illness had, bacteria from food had gotten into your bloodstream, then vomiting could be induced. Similarly, the medulla oblongata has centers for sneezing, so that would be like a respiratory protective reflex, and for coughing. And the last thing, you can kind of make an X like this, because in the medulla is when the pyramidal tracts cross. So what that means is that if you initiate a motor output from the precentral gyrus on the left side of the brain, when it gets down to the medulla, it will cross and it will control the right side of the body. So the right side of the body is controlled by the left side of the brain, and the left side of the body is controlled by the right side of the brain. So if someone loses the ability to move their left arm after a stroke, it indicates that the damage was actually in the right side of the brain, probably somewhere in the motor cortex. Okay, then the last thing on this page of your notes is just a couple of comments about the cerebellum. Down here. The cerebellum is helpful in coordination of movements and also some spatial skills, maybe even some kinds of puzzle solving. I've even read that the cerebellum is now credited with some of a person's ability to solve riddles. So if you like Lord of the Rings and you like The Hobbit and the riddles that go on between Gollum and Bilbo, then maybe Bilbo being a hobbit, they all have well-developed cerebellums because they're good at riddles.